What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, the #1 ideological resource on the interwebs for theology. That's right, over 1,000 episodes, over 11 years of theological hype right to your earbuds. And today on the podcast, we have a return visit from the professor at Duke University's Divinity School, Norman Wirzba. We're going to talk about ecology. We're going to talk about food. We're going to talk about the agrarian turn. We're going to talk about some zesty excitement. But first, I want to remind you that on the 20th and 21st of September 2019, I'll be in Indianapolis. On the 27th and 28th, I will be at an event called Called to Be Prophets right here in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, in Cary to be exact. You should go check those out. Go to the events page at tripfuller.com. That's Trip with 2 P's. So I thought I'd take this moment as we are about to begin the podcast to give some shout outs to some new Homebrewed Christianity community members. That's right, new members. First up, Josue, brand new Homebrewed Christianity member. But oh, no, Josue is not alone. We also have Renee, brand new elder at Homebrewed Christianity. Robert, Jared, Brian McLaren. Wow! Brian McLaren became an elder. There you go. Check them facts. Michael, Silas, Matt Willis, good. That's how people would have chanted your name if you're a professional athlete. Anytime there's like multiple O's in a last name in a sport and they do good, people just emphasize it. So it's like we're cheering for you, but it also kind of sounds like boo, but we know it's not because it's your last name and we love you. Oh, yeah. Also, Daniel. So there are a host of new members to Homebrewed Christianity, and I'm excited. And some of them are old members who are renewed into the brand new Homebrewed Christianity member system. Why would they do that? Because we got a whole new membership set up on the back end that gives you access to, guess what? The members-only podcast. That's right. The deacons, the elders, the bishops get access to the Homebrewed Christianity community podcast. There's already like 12, 13 episodes on it, including deep dives into a number of different readings from some of our reading groups, lectures from Caputo. There's some from the Theology and Culture class. And guess what? Coming up soon. And this is just a lure, you could say. But I'm going to start sharing in the community feed the lectures of Walter Brueggemann's intro to the Hebrew Bible. Check them facts. When we did the Adult Vacation Bible School class, I just got sent the audio recordings of those. And I'm like, oh, those are too good. Remembering the experience of intro to the Hebrew Bible with Walter Brueggemann, that we're gonna release those for the members. So if you want to get those along with all the other stuff, and there's gonna be some high quality process ones. I did a theology nerd boot camp with John Cobb, Sally McFay, and Jay McDaniel. That's coming up in the members only podcast. So go ahead, go to homebrewedcommunity.com or just go to the website, click on join, become a deacon, an elder, a bishop, and you'll get access to a podcast that is just for the members. And if you want to even level up further, you want to become an elder, like Silas or Michael or Brian McLaren, if you want to do that, Renee, Trey, if you want to be an elder like them, or Stephen or Everett, there's a whole, they're about to get the invitation to the first session of the systematic theology class. It's going to be running all year long. Throughout this school year, I'm going to be doing an intro to theology class to give everyone the background info that so many of the people that come on the podcast assume. So if you've been wanting to have a taste of systematic theology at the like what happens at seminaries and divinity schools without student loans, just a monthly donation to support the work of Homebrewed and to join to be a part of the community. If you want to do that, then join up. You'll also get an invite into the member community Facebook group. We'll interact on the internet and all that kind of good stuff. You'll be able to get access to videos of a lot of the different interviews and things, to live events. The members already have access, all of them, to the lectures from Theology Beer Camp in Asheville. They get to see Travis McMackin's lecture, Adonna Bowman's, Robin Henderson Espinosa, some amazing conversations we had. Anyway, if you want to join, I'm really grateful. You know, we're at 0.25% of the listeners. And if we get to 0.5%, you know what? I'll just cry in the podcast intro. All right. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode. It was a ton of fun. I really am grateful to Dr. Wirzba for inviting me into his office at Duke. And it was a blast. Learned a lot. And yeah, you're gonna dig this. So I hope to see you if you're in Indy on the 20th and 21st. And if you want to come out for some amazing fun in Cary, North Carolina, Called to Be Prophets, Brian McLaren, Elder Brian McLaren is going to be there. Robin Henderson Espinosa is going to be there. Steve Davidson, amazing post-colonial Hebrew Bible scholar, is going to be in the house. So do it. All right. Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity. This is Tripp, and I am here at Duke University, the Divinity School, with Norman Wirzba, and we are going to talk about religion, science, food. Who knows what else is going to come up.
All right, good to be with you, Tripp.
I know you haven't been on the podcast in 6 years.
Oh my, that's a long time.
I know, but you said yes a second time, and now I'm back in North Carolina, so this will be fun. Maybe the place to begin is for you to share your own kind of story of faith and how you became not just a person of faith, but an intellectual, and how the intellectual quest came to be vocationally important to you.
Well, I never would have imagined that I would have become an academic or that I would be doing intellectual work, because I grew up farming in Southern Alberta and building houses and doing construction. So my association with work was embodied work, taking care of animals, taking care of fields, building things, making things. And I absolutely loved that work. But I was also coming of age into adulthood, that is, in the 1980s, which was a terrible time to think about trying to be a farmer. Land prices were ridiculously high, and you had to become a very big operation for banks to support you. And in the meantime, I loved what I was doing at the university. I was a history major at the time, and I had some professors who were just fabulous. They mentored me because I didn't come from a family where everybody went to university. Mm-hmm. And these are the folks who said, we think you've got some abilities here. Why don't you consider an academic career? And of course, this was a time when people thought there would actually be academic jobs, but
I've heard about that.
Yeah, that promise just kept being deferred. So I chose the most lucrative PhD route, which was the philosophy PhD. Of course, there are almost no jobs there, but I did get lucky, and I got a job for a couple of years, and in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, of all places. It was a lovely place, a university there at St. Thomas More College. And in my first semester, my chair of the department said, "Can you teach an environmental ethics course?" And I knew nothing about environmental ethics because my work in philosophy and religion was 19th and 20th century French and German thought. And these were not people who were heavily engaged in environmental matters, although some were gesturing in that direction, interestingly. But I said, sure, of course I'll teach that course. And I remember coming home the first night. It was a once-a-week seminar in the evenings, telling my wife after the class, I think I just told them everything I know. And so it's going to be a lot of work being ready for each of those class sessions. And so I read a lot. A lot of it wasn't that great because in the 1993 period, so to speak, most environmental ethics was either using John Stuart Mill or Immanuel Kant to do environmental thinking. And I thought, this is kind of a dead end. But in the end, I kept an interest in it. And what I liked about it was that it helped me think about things outside of the sort of technicalities of French and German phenomenology. But I stayed in Saskatoon for just 2 years, moved to Kentucky. And that's where things really changed for me, because that's where I met Wendell Berry and we became friends. And he showed me that there's a tradition called agrarianism, which is a very old tradition extending back to the ancient Greeks, ancient Chinese, Japanese, and also the Hebrew Bible. And these were people who were talking about the human place in the world, not as the kind of abstraction that you get often in environmental thinking in America, where it seems like the emphasis is all on wilderness, which is the place where human beings don't belong. And I thought that's a peculiar way to think about environment. And so what agrarianism did for me is it gave me an opportunity to think about how human labor, as in taking care of plants, animals, fields, forests, waters, all of these very basic ecological realities, how taking care of them helps us understand the character of the world, its meaning, but also what a possibly good human life might look like. And so the great gift that Wendell gave me, besides giving me a whole corpus of thinking and practice in these agrarian traditions, is that he gave me a way to integrate my own experience as a farm kid who wanted to farm and an academic who wants to teach and write. And so they have now come together in the most wonderful way.
Mm-hmm. So how do you introduce the concept of agrarianism? Like when people's experience with nature, with food, with farming and the land, when there's a growing alienation between the individual and the rest of nature,
right?
How do you introduce it as a historic, alive option, a vision that's
Yeah. So the first thing I tell people is I don't expect you to become farmers, because to be a farmer, a good one anyway, you have to be really smart, have a really broad and complex skill set, and not many people have that.
That's what you tell the Duke students. You're like, look,
you're smart. You're smart, but yeah, farming, it requires special kinds of people, and it requires a community that raises up these people, mm-hmm. because you can do a lot through YouTube, learning how to do various things. But it's really a tradition and a community that's going to help you figure it out in the details. So the first thing I tell students is that they are living in an experiment that we don't know what the effect is going to be long term. And the experiment is this. Around the year 2000, for the first time, we had more people living in cities than living on the land. Mm. That's enormous, because when you think about how through most of human history, going back 15, 20,000 years, human beings to live had to know a tremendous amount about the places of their life. They had to understand animals. They had to understand plants. They had to understand what makes them healthy, what makes them sick. They had to understand things about soil erosion, soil fertility. The knowledge wasn't always adequate, for sure, but they had to know these things, and they had to sort of tune their expectations for their own lives in terms of the expectations of land, plants, and animals. Mm-hmm. And that means basically, practically, when you get up in the morning, your first thought isn't about what you want to do. The first thought is about what you need to do, because your animals have things they need. Your fields need things. Your plants need to be harvested now. You can't wait a month, right? So your whole orientation in the world is outwardly directed to these ecological agricultural realities. And students need to understand that we're in a completely new situation as urbanites. And as you think about how, because urbanization isn't just one thing, the character of so much urbanization today is to further insulate people from ecological realities. Because historically, many of our cities, first of all, they weren't as large as they now are. But even the cities that were larger, agriculture was still an ever-present reality. You smelled animals. Right? You just did. And people went in and out. The border between city and agriculture wasn't so clearly defined. So once students understand that we're in a completely new situation, I then tell them, but you still eat. You still drink. You still consume energy, which means you have to be thinking about how your choices as an eater, drinker, energy user, how these decisions you make have implications for the land, mm-hmm. for water systems, for forests, for mountaintops, that are being blown to pieces to get to their coal more efficiently and more cheaply. And so what that does is it, I hope, helps them understand that even though they are not farmers, it's an illusion to think that they are post-agricultural or post-ecological beings. And that's the big mistake people make. They think that the decisions they make as citizens or as consumers do not need to take into account the basic reality of something like food. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is that kind of ignorance, that kind of naivete, has created conditions in which people now wonder, people who know things about agricultural economies are wondering whether we're going to be able to feed the world's population in the matter of a few decades.
Yeah, I mean, just that example of waking up where there are demands on you because you have to be responsible to all the life and the role and responsibility you have in it. I mean, when you think of urban living, when you live in a city, the age at which you have children goes later and the number of kids you have goes down. I mean, like outside of, a dog or a child, there are very few things where, you wake up and there's an other whose life requires you to be responsible. Yeah. And we're not just alienated from, growing our food and relating to animals. We're also putting off and postponing, anyone putting demands on us.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good observation.
And people say, I want my freedom longer. I want this,
Yeah. So we can come back to the question of freedom, which I think is an enormously important question. But one of the things I do with my students in some of my classes is, as part of the semester, I ask them to grow a plant so that by the end of the semester, they can eat something that they grew. And what's striking to students is that many of them have never grown anything. So they don't know the first thing about soil, about seed, what kind of plant they want to grow, how far to put the seed in the soil, what kind of watering regime do I put in place. They don't know any of those things. And I tell them, I want you to keep a journal where you keep track, not just of what's happening with your plant, but what's happening to you. What are you learning about yourself? And about half the students regularly get nothing. They either can't get the seed to germinate, or they get it to germinate, but they forget to water it for a month and it's dead. And they have to deal with the frustration of not being able to take care of a simple plant. And then I ask them, if you can't take care of a plant, how are you going to take care of a community? Because first of all, a plant is a whole lot easier than a community of people. And so what it requires, what gets people is they realize how much they want to have life on their own terms. Yeah. Which means they get to be the boss of their schedule. They get to be the boss of their decisions. And farming is completely unromantic because you don't get to be the boss. It's everything else that tells you what to do. And so people who say that agrarians romanticize agricultural life, I want to say there's nothing further from the truth. Actually do the work and you'll discover it ain't romantic at all. In fact, it's inherently difficult, exhausting, frustrating, where you're constantly coming face to face with your own incompetence and your own ignorance. And yeah, there are beautiful moments, like when you get to go pick tomatoes or raspberries, or you get to see a baby calf being born, or all those things. But when you're in that world, you're always aware of the fact that you can make a small mistake and that calf is dead. And then you got to deal with it. And this is something I think our culture, again, just has very little patience or capacity for. And that is when you're living in agricultural realities, or when you're in ecological systems, death is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to deal with death. And so we just turn away from it. And, we prefer to look at screens and order our food through touch.
Oh, yeah. And I think we even, avoid interacting with people that remind us of our infinitude. The way our society treats people with different, disabilities, the way we deal with the elderly and the sick and things like that. Any body, physical thing that symbolizes our finitude, makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if the word unwillingness, or maybe it's a kind of fear about what care will demand of us. And that's, I think, a serious thing that we need to come to terms with. And it connects, I think, with the question of freedom. In some ways, the emancipatory ideal, which has been with us for several centuries now, which is a peculiarly modern idea, it's emancipation not just from nature, it's also emancipation from physical labor. And so the quintessential person who is not free is the manual laborer. It's the slave. It's the domestic servant. It's today's migrant worker. These people who are doing the indispensable work of cultivation, of food production, of of making food, of cleaning a home, of making order in your home spaces. These are the people who are on the bottom of our sort of assessment of human success. And we have to ask the question, and we certainly have to ask that as Christians, what has happened such that in the very first, well, we can argue about whether it's actually the first, but the Genesis creation story in the Garden of Eden, where God is a gardener who creates this garden, creates the first human beings out of the ground, and then says to this Adam, take care of the garden, right? And taking care of the garden is not a punishment. This is something you do as part of what it means to be a human being, because it's unless you take care of other living things, you're not going to know who God is, because that's what God does, and you're not going to know how to participate in a human life that realizes the fullness of life, not just for yourself and your community and family, but for the whole world. And so that refusal of care, I think, is a fundamental Christian confusion when they think that, yeah, those aren't the important things that we have to do.
Now, one of the things that popped in my head there is the way in which, by avoiding the gaze of the other, be it in nature or your neighbor that is in need and they demand care, right? Avoiding that gaze and avoiding the situation where responsibility can't be hidden, covered up, and stuff. That, in one sense, as a Christian, that's avoiding the situation where God shows up as the stranger.
Yeah.
Right? And I think one of the problems in the way freedom played out in modernity is that the notion of the self as this individual, meant that we at least prioritized piety, where we discovered God was always already near us, closer than, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then separated ourselves from piety that's shaped by God as the stranger, the other, the one that shakes up, the one that makes demands.
Yeah.
And when, and when the demand comes, we want it set on our own terms now.
Right.
Like that's to me one of the difficulties of the way politics around identity plays out, is that now your own identification of yourself comes with a demand put on the other for recognition, not a demand when you recognize the other for neighborliness.
Yeah. No, that's a good observation. I think a way to frame this too that might be helpful is around the issue of hospitality, right? Many of the great religious traditions, but certainly Christianity and Judaism, emphasize hospitality as one of the cardinal ways through which human beings encounter Christ, but also actually communicate something about God's own hospitable ways with us, with the whole of creation, right? God makes room for something other than God to be, and then nurtures it into the fullness of its life, right? Now, when you think about, and Christine Pohl has written about this, that hospitality has fallen on hard times, at least as it was characterized and practiced in more ancient cultures. Because when you have an individuated culture where people, live in their own private dwelling places, they got privacy fences and there's no front porch and there's just a sense that you retreat into your house where it's your own domain. By yourself, it's going to be terrifying to think about a stranger coming in through your front door, because in a climate of fear like we're in, you wonder, is this person going to do me harm?
Yeah.
And what we forget is that in most cultures, people lived a much more communal life. And so it wasn't all on you, right? That there was a sense that the hospitality that we offer to each other, where we can encounter each other, is shared with other people. And it requires us to have a different understanding about who we are. First of all, we're not individuals. First and foremost, we're communal beings, or as Christians would say, we're ecclesial beings, where we share in the life of a body that together does the work of witnessing to God in the world. And that means we have to share our lives in all sorts of ways. And I think that has implications for the way we understand built environments, but it certainly has implications for the ways we think about what a successful human life ought to be. It needs to be one in which, as you say, it's not about having everybody acknowledge me as an individual, but it's about learning how we understand other people as entering into our lives so as to, in our shared life together, we understand something about our world, we understand something about who God is, we understand something about what our real work is going forward.
Yeah. What came to mind in that conversation around hospitality is, what's the guy that did Anatheism?
Oh yeah, Richard Carney.
Richard Carney, when he reads,
Yeah.
the Abraham story of greeting the strangers,
Yeah.
He points out that, a lot of times in our context, when someone's coming over the hill towards you in a desert and there's a group of men coming, you don't immediately go, I hope they're coming for dinner. Right? Like, it's not like there's a police department that you can call on your cell phone and that kind of thing. So the hospitality was itself a dangerous act. And then when you think of, giving the orders, oh, we all start preparing dinner, let me get our food out. When you can't go to the grocery store, you're not giving out of just like some abundance that you can replenish at any time. Like when you kill the calf, that calf's dead and it's not like you can go get another one.
And the calf is your livelihood.
Right. And so like that's what, when you're talking about hospitality there's a difference between hospitality we're going to welcome everyone in the safest way possible or whatever. And a hospitality where, there is that risk involved and there is, the materiality of sharing your access to life with the other.
Yeah. So what you're saying brings up another, I think, very, very important point. People have long understood that life is costly, right? For you to live, others have to die. Mm-hmm. Even if you're vegetarian. Sorry. And that's terrifying news to deal with because I think many of us want to think that life is not costly. And so as long as you live in a sort of consumer culture or a commodity culture, everything that you have, you've purchased. Okay. So there's been a price associated with it, but it's a price that you could afford. And I think what people previous to this way of being in the world, which is a rather new way of being in the world, we need to be clear about that. Consumerism as a way of life doesn't really develop until the 20th century.
Right.
So before that, people understood that whenever I consume something, another's life has been affected. And so when I offer something to somebody, there's the full recognition of all the costliness that is involved, all the life, all the struggle, all the death, all the illness. It's all built into whatever we offer to each other, right? So there's a world of difference between going to Home Depot and buying a 2x4 versus managing a forest in which you understand that these trees, they take decades to mature. I'm not just going to chop them down for no reason because they're just not going to be there the next day after I chop them down. There's a kind of vulnerability about life, a kind of fragility about life. And what that means, and this is the big theological point. Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace a long time ago. I want to expand that notion of cheap grace because we think that we live in a world of gifts. We still use that language, right? These are the gifts of God for the people of God, we say. But we really don't believe that they're gifts because we've purchased them first. Mm-hmm. And so the minute purchasing comes into the equation, we're now thinking about things in terms of what we buy rather than thinking about things in terms of the integrity, the sanctity, the fragility of their own lives. It's a radically different way of understanding what kind of a world we're in, but also a radically different way of thinking about how we live with others, through others, in these very costly forms of sacrifice. You have to almost use that word.
Yeah, and I think that money, debt, things like that, give us a narrative that it gives us permission to not acknowledge or cover up or remain alienated from the material existence behind it, be it the pillaging of the planet, the exploitation of the poor,
right?
And a global market has meant, as Americans, we have, we established child labor laws and things out of the social gospel movement.
Right.
And so now we have to order our jeans from Sri Lanka.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Like, so we think we're better because the world we see that we can, and interact with looks better than it would have 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And yet, the planet, the poor, that type of, the actual output are relationships as mediated, by capital and the markets, are not.
Yeah. I mean, one way to put this is to say that we live in an anonymous economy. And that means stuff comes to us from this big veil, which we don't know what's behind it, right? We shop in mostly ignorant circumstances. We don't know how the thing came to be. We don't know the costs associated with the thing that we're purchasing. We don't know the history of human involvement with that thing. Wendell Berry gave this a great description when he called it the economy of the one-night stand. And what he meant by that is we meet in the dark, we have a good time, we pay our money, and we don't ask any questions. And this is why, we can advocate for something like a local economy, not because a local economy is perfect, but at least what local economies do is they shorten the distance between producer and consumer so that maybe people will shop with a little less ignorance. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll shop having actually become just a bit involved in the production of things, right? I think the fact that we have sort of relegated ourselves to the status of shoppers means that we live in the most ignorant, naive understanding of the world that has ever been for people, because as a consumer, you don't have to have any skill. You don't have to have any knowledge. All you gotta have is a credit card mm-hmm. and a screen. And, you can be sitting on your sofa in your pajamas and order everything you need to live, and it'll be delivered to your door. It's an incredible thing. But what it means is that you have an economy that's sort of like a magic show. You tap the hat and stuff just keeps coming out. Mm-hmm. And you wonder one day, are we going to tap the hat and there won't be anything there?
Yeah. And, that is a genuine fear. And well, I don't want to go out there quite yet, but, so one of the things you mentioned at the front was when you first started teaching environmental ethics, that the ethical frameworks that you have are a kind of utilitarian one and a Kantian one. And both of those kind of presume, enlightenment rationality in the individual, right, which kind of entails like whatever logic that comes out of it,
right,
is one that is already compatible with the institutions and structures that you're raising questions and problematizing.
Right.
So when you're wanting to think about environmental ethics that don't have a framework, that kind of continues to propagate kind of unexamined assumptions that create the issue, how do you begin?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of ways I think that you can begin. And, the hope is that you would bring these different entry points alongside each other so that they can illuminate each other in all sorts of ways. But, one of the things that you do is you start by simply trying to understand the character of the world that we're in, because how you describe the world, what you understand the world to be, is going to have major implications for how you're actually going to position yourself in that world. So, for instance, for a long time, we've wanted to assume that the human being is an individual, right? Atomized, as Charles Taylor would talk about it, or individuated, or whatever, isolated even. But what if that conception is fundamentally wrong? So, for instance, in more recent science, forget about the ecological turn. Just think about the turn that we call the microbiome revolution in science, right? Some people are saying that the microbiome in the way we understand the functioning of living organisms is as major and as revolutionary as Darwin's evolutionary hypothesis was. The biome says that you are not yourself. You never have been, because there are more other organisms, more other species in you than you yourself could ever be. And so the shorthand way to put this is to say you are a zoo. Okay? You have never been one. You have never been single. You have never been unitary. And what the microbiome is teaching us is that without these microorganisms inhabiting our bodies, we could not even do the things that our bodies do. We could not even think and feel, because affective processes, our neurological system, our digestive system, so many of the very basic things that keep our bodies functioning depend upon our bodies hosting billions of organisms. Well, what does that do then for the way you think about yourself in terms of your relationship to the world? Well, interestingly, the biome that's in our gut has all sorts of analogies with the biome that's in the soil. Mm-hmm. So just as we've used antibiotics and other sorts of pharmacological, let's just call them poisons, to heal ourselves, we've done the same thing with our soil. We've pounded it with all these toxins right? We call them herbicides or pesticides, and we've used synthetic fertilizers. So we're destroying the biome in the soil just like we're destroying the biome in our guts. And as a result, we're dealing with major sickness on both sides. Now, my point is not to say let's get rid of antibiotics. That's not my point. It's to understand how you can't simply presume upon the complexity of life because you've got some narrow understanding of what a thriving organism or a productive organism ought to be. Mm-hmm. So you have to expand your imagination for the world. Now, if you think of yourself as not just one thing, but as a constellation of all sorts of organisms, we can still talk intelligently about Tripp and Norm and whatever else kind of person. But what we've got to realize now is the sense that the human being could somehow rise above ecosystem processes or biophysical properties, biochemical. That's just a false understanding of who you are. And so we have to start by correcting that. So that's one thing that we can do, I think, that, and this is, of course, was nowhere on the radar for people like Mill or Kant, because they had already separated the human being and then given them this sort of almost omniscient position to look over the world and make judgments about the world and manipulate the world to their own choosing. But now you can't do that anymore because how you affect the world affects you in ways that you could never have imagined. Right? So that's one way. I think another way is to try to rehabilitate some thinking about virtue. Right? There's the Aristotelian Thomistic framework, obviously, around virtue. But the question is basically not just what kind of a moral calculus can you put in place to determine right and wrong. It's a question about how we think about ourselves. What kinds of characteristics do we need to develop? What sorts of moral sensitivities, what sorts of affections and sympathies do we need so that we can live in a world in such a way that our presence in the world is a beneficial presence rather than a destructive one? Because right now, it's pretty clear that human beings have become the most destructive species that the world has known. And so we call this the Anthropocene world.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a world that we now have created. It doesn't mean that there aren't weather systems, that there aren't going to be earthquakes because of tectonic plates moving around. Of course, that's still going to happen. But what we now know is that because human beings have exerted through their economies, through their technological development, industrial processes, that they've developed the kinds of powers such that any of these, what we used to call natural events, can no longer be understood apart from that human influence. So we've become the major change agents. So it's at precisely the time when human beings understand how what they decide has implications for the whole world and all of its millions of species of life. That's precisely the point where I would think we have to figure out now, is the knowledge that we've developed, is it adequate to the task? Can we be a presence that is healing rather than destroying, degrading, exhausting? And that, I think, is the major work going forward, right? I've got children. I think, what kind of a world are they going to be living in when they hit my age? Right? We already know with a fair amount of clarity that cities like Miami, they're not going to be habitable by the end of this century. So where do those millions of people go? Right? Southern Florida. How are we making plans for that kind of a reality? How are we dealing with the fact that agricultural systems right now, because of climate change, because of rising temperatures, because of much more volatile weather systems, how are we preparing to feed projected 10 billion people when the possibility for the dependability of agricultural cycles and rhythms has been shot out the window? How are we going to grow enough food for everybody? Right? These are major questions that are going to require of us new ways of imagining, right? So the emancipatory ideal that says, get away from nature, be free of nature, we're now having to do the reverse. We're going to have to think, okay, there isn't such a thing as stable nature anymore.
Right.
We've got a volatile world, an unpredictable world. How are we going to develop the kinds of sympathies and affections, but also the very nimble skills that we're going to need to make it possible for us to secure a life for ourselves while also protecting, conserving the lives of others.
And I think getting there, like you can see yourself as part of nature intellectually before you do existentially.
Right.
And in the same way that, you could give an intellectual account of any religious tradition, but you have no idea what it's like to be one.
Right.
until you embody it.
Right.
And I think the same is true about recognizing our place in nature. Since we're in your office behind you, I can see the book that I had the experience with, the Foltz book, the green one.
Yes.
The essay called On the Uncanny Goodness of Being Edible to Bears.
Yeah.
It was my first interdisciplinary seminar at Claremont. Phil Clayton was doing a ecological science and philosophy class.
Yeah.
And we read that article, and it set up crazy dreams.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm taking the class because I'm interested.
Right.
But I had this dream that I got ate by a bear and crapped out. And I'm like, in the dream and realizing I must be dreaming because I'm now experiencing consciousness that with continuity of myself as a bear turd.
Right.
And I'm like, God, what in the world? And God said, it is good. And after that, I like that article kind of occasioned that moment.
Yeah.
But I felt like it was a real shift in the sense that the very same ideas I would have said, that's really good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Felt different.
Yeah.
And I wonder if so much of church life today actually helps preserve the subject from ever having that encounter rather than introducing it to them. Or gives a divine distancing act or a narrative that doesn't include nature.
Right.
And its salvation story and such doesn't preserve that existential shift, even if you think, I'm worried about the world we're handing our kids.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on there because I think it's without doubt in my mind that so many churches are presuming that the world is basically a stage upon which the really cool stuff happens between people and then hopefully between people and God. And at the end of your faith journey, the point is to get away, to be with God somewhere beyond the blue. Right? That is, I think, an incredibly destructive, let's even use the word heretical way of thinking about Christianity, because what it does is it denies the incarnation at its most fundamental meaning. Because it's not just that God became human in the person of Jesus, but that in the body of Jesus, the fullness of God dwelt. Not a little slice, not just a temporary bit, but the fullness of God, as the letter in Colossians says. That's a game changer.
Yeah.
Because it says now embodiment's not the problem. And before you get all mushy and say, okay, embodiment, joins us to nature and Mother Nature is so beautiful and warm and huggy and all that sort of stuff. The reality, of course, is that nature can be nasty. Right? So it's not just that you can get eaten by a bear. Do something a whole lot more quaint, which is just to lay down in a garden and just experience how long it takes before bugs start biting you because they want to eat you. Mm-hmm. Because as this dean from Cambridge, Ralph Inge, said a long time ago, all of nature is a conjugation of the verb to eat. Right? So everything wants to eat everything else. Well, not everything else, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So just as you want to eat from the world, because that's what your body requires of you, everything else that's living wants to eat too. And you're part of the food chain. But it's a kind of exceptionalism that says, no, we can't be part of the food chain. We have to be above it. We have to be outside of it. And so we even do crazy things like at the point of death. What do? We lace our bodies full of poison, put them in a coffin that is completely sealed so that nothing can come eat you. And of course, this is the exact wrong thing to do from a biblical point of view because you come from the soil, as Genesis 2 says, and you go back to the soil that nurtures you. Upon your death, you nurture it, right? I just wrote a little essay about Saint Phocas, who is this guy who lived in Turkey a long time ago. And it's a great story. And what happens is he's a Christian in the Roman Empire, and the emperor's not happy with Christians, and so he's systematically going around trying to find leading Christian figures to execute them. And so 2 soldiers that have been sent out by the emperor finally come to this region of Turkey, and they say, we're looking for Phocas. And he says, why? Because we have to kill him. And Phocas has got his little farm outside the city. And he says, I know where Phocas is. Let me make you dinner. You guys have a good night's sleep. You've been walking for days. And in the morning, I'll show you where he is. So they're very relieved because they now know they're going to find this guy. So while they go to sleep, Phocas goes into his garden and he digs a grave. In the morning, he wakes up, feeds the guys and says, okay, where's Phocas? And they said, well, it's easy. I'm the guy. And they said, whoa, wait a minute. We don't want to kill you. because you've been so generous with us. You've been so kind. You've been hospitable, right? To bring back that word. And Focus says, no, you have to kill me. And you have to put me in the grave in my garden, because the garden has fed me and it's enabled me to feed lots of other people like you. And now it's time for me to feed the garden. And so the soldiers went out, killed him, and threw him in the grave, and he became food for the garden. Okay? Now, this sounds kind of crass, but this is in fact how our bodies are, right? We come out of the ground. We're fed by everything that comes out of the ground, the plant and animal life. And so for us to do this really ungrateful gesture at the end of our life, which is to put bodies in a casket, in a ground, so full of poison so that if anything tries to eat you, it dies, that's really sick.
Yeah. Yeah, but if some version of you isn't there when the trumpet sounds, what's going to get resurrected? I remember when.
So it's only until we developed all these poisons that we could have a resurrection.
That's what I was sitting there. I was like, so what you're saying is, affluent first world people in the world's greatest empire have a better shot of being resurrected
exactly
than the martyrs in the early church?
Yeah, I think
this
so.
Is really, it's
like, pretty twisted.
Yeah, that's kind of offensive.
Yeah, for sure.
You're like, the one who became incarnate was like, that's fine, but I really need some bones. I need at least bones.
Yeah.
To work with.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see the shifts going in and out of the Enlightenment in the way God relates to nature being a part of the way, maybe the background story that's alive in the church and alive in the West that keeps us alienated from nature?
Wow, that's a complicated question. There's lots of ways to sort of enter into it. I think one thing that you can certainly suggest is that the doctrine of creation becomes something fundamentally different in Enlightenment period and following. And what I mean by that is, if you think about how the doctrine of creation emerges in Scripture and how it gets developed by different theologians, it's quite clear that the doctrine of creation was never simply some articulation of how the world began a long, long time ago. A lot of times, creationists today, for instance, will assert that that's fundamentally what the doctrine of creation is about. You just got to be able to say, God made it a long, long time ago, and then you fight about how many years ago that was.
Just not that long ago.
Right. And that's just goofy, because first of all, the biblical writers understand that we weren't around when God was making the world, so there's nothing for us to say about it. Okay? So that's one thing. The second thing is to forget then that the doctrine of creation is fundamentally not about how the world began a long time ago, but that it began with God, and therefore creates the world as a particular kind of reality having a certain kind of character. And that's to say then that the whole world from the beginning has a kind of significance that always orients it to God, because it comes from God, which is another fancy way of saying everything that is made by God has sacred significance. It's all holy. So you have to take care of all of it. And so it's not surprising then that as theologians developed a teaching about the doctrine, about the creation, it was not just about origins, it was also about salvation, and it was also about eschatology, about the end of things. And so when you think about creation in that much, much more expansive way, you're now talking about what's the meaning of the world? To what end should we be using things in the world? What's going to be the final destination of everything? That's how the doctrine of creation gets developed. But what happens, of course, in modernity is you get this thing called deism that comes along, and you get the elimination of final causes in modern science, and suddenly you can't talk about the purpose of anything.
Right.
And what you've done with the modern epistemologies that get developed by people like Locke and others, you reduce things of qualities, and everything becomes a quantity measure. And so you can't talk about the meaning and value of things. Everything becomes amoral, valueless, which means then that you can now do with things whatever you want,
right,
because they have no sacred significance. And so modern ways of talking about the world, even though they might still use the language called creation, They are as far away from an understanding of the world as the place where God is constantly at work through the power of the Holy Spirit. That's just gone. Mm-hmm. And instead you get this valueless, amoral realm that exists to be mined and manipulated in all the ways that we now do in the varying forms of engineering that are radically transforming not just the planet's surface, but also the organisms that move around on that surface when we do things like, genetic engineering.
Yeah, it is fascinating how successful, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, and everybody at internalizing themselves in just the cultural assumptions that each kid learns from their parents. And you never have to tell a fundamentalist to become a modernist, because they all are one. Yeah. And without knowing it. Right. And then they just go read the Bible and read it through a hermeneutic that assumes that kind of dichotomy between qualitative reality and quantitative. Right. And I was reading this book that's coming out soon by Philip Goff, who's a philosopher, kind of part of in analytic philosophy, the revival of panpsychism. And it's on Galileo and how he talks about how Galileo, when he's describing the work of a scientist, that their focus is primarily on quantitative existence, because that has its own reality external to you. Mm-hmm. And that qualitative reality, he says, is the creation of one's own soul. And so the qualitative experience that each of us has is part of the dignity of our souls. Right. And the only problem is, once the Enlightenment takes quantitative thinking and turns around and kills the soul, then now you're just left with what a physicist eventually acknowledges is in their domain. Right. Yeah. And so, like you said, no more final causation, any of that, just efficient causation. Right. That's all that's there. Yeah. And what the saddest part for me is, other than the coolest philosophy questions like origins, consciousness, things like that you don't get to talk about that much, is that if you don't challenge that, then you can give someone the gospel intellectually, or maybe they can have occasional experiences of it. Right. But their full humanity, which was their initial gift of grace, is left diminished. Right. And then you end up in a culture where you're anxious, where you're alienated, and where you're cut off. Yeah. And if the gospel has to be reduced to that type of epistemology, then it's already deflated. And so what if one of the biggest challenges for our context and our situation isn't telling people that exist in Christendom and think of themselves as a sinner, God will forgive them, but just looking at the West and realizing they've lost the dignity that God gave us in creation itself, and creating communities that gives us back our humanity, and that means a humanity that's nested in nature. Yeah, that and what's crazy is, like, I think about that all the time, and I'm still not sure I'm good at parenting. It takes an actual community that has stories, narratives, and practices that talk about the bigness of it and the depth of it for it to ring true. Yeah. So no, I think there's an enormous amount in what you've just been talking about. So we still use the words from Scripture that have been used for now thousands of years. Mm-hmm. But what those words might signify, how we might live into the meaning of those words, has changed so dramatically. So, the historian Hobsbawm once said that the Industrial Revolution is such a watershed moment that the people who lived 100 years before it could have as well lived 5,000 years before it, because it's such a sea change in the way people think about what kind of a world they live in, who they are, right? You get this machine imagery now that infuses our imagination so that we now think about human progress, human happiness in all sorts of new ways. So what I would want to say is, I think it's very important for churches, instead of just rehearsing the words over and over again, because it doesn't matter if you can still say the word grace. You don't know what the word means if you're simply sitting on your couch looking at screens most of the day, or you're in an office like I am looking at my computer all day. What does the word grace mean in that form of life?
I've had students who tell me they'll take a class with me, say, on food and food systems in the life of faith, and we talk a lot about growing food in the course. And they'll tell me that after they've taken the course, they may have gone interned at a farm somewhere. Mm-hmm. And they come back a year later and they'll tell me, I had no idea. I read the words. I could understand the words. I wrote a paper using those words. You seem to like them well enough to give me a good grade. I had no idea what I was talking about. Mm-hmm. Because the experience of putting your body in touch with other bodies, submitting your body to weather, to disease, right, to impotence, all of those things, they're game changers. So when we use words like salvation or words like sanctification, what in the world do they mean when you live mostly looking at screens and through shopping? Mm-hmm. They mean something. They can't mean what they would have meant to somebody, right, who's growing grapes in a semi-arid region called Israel.
Right.
It's just not going to work in the same sorts of ways. We think about security or we think about safety in terms of insurance companies. Mm-hmm. We don't think about security in terms of a community coming alongside to help us because we're too afraid to let other people know that we even have needs. So the forms of life that so many of us now occupy render us unable to understand the words that we in fact use. And we use them fairly intelligently, or at least grammatically correctly, but we don't actually have any kind of depth resonance with them.
Mm-hmm. Right now I'm in the middle of editing a bunch of early church fathers' work on contemplative prayer or contemplative readings of scripture and stuff like that, and working on introductions for stuff. And I realized, arbitrarily, like while reading it, that they are assuming people don't have electricity, right? Like don't have light bulbs, like and underneath the teachings of the contemplatives is like there's half the day you're in the dark, and you're either like interacting with the people that are closest to you, sleeping, or God's waiting.
Yeah.
Like cultivating silence is not something you do in 20-minute spurts on occasion because your app reminded you.
Right.
Then like it was half your day and it was a live option.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm sitting there reading it and underneath it, Clement of Alexandria has this line that says like, and in the silence when you hear nothing, that which you most need to hear shall ring. And we have created a world where our vocation, our output, our identity, and it's existing on social media have so cannibalized the times where if we just listen to the tradition, your most true moments, your most human moments are ones that only can happen when you've cultivated enough silence to turn off your thinking, to stop trying to do, and just receive the gift of God. And it made me sit there and go, oh, we might just be so screwed. Like,
yeah, no, I hear you.
Church is teaching how to be the habits of a healthy leader and successful, how to be successful and how to be efficient and all this kind of stuff in small groups. And then the early church is like manuals on how to be really silent and useless until God shows up.
Yeah, you're going to start a corporation, aren't you?
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's just it's a really helpful way to help us understand that the time in which we live is so unprecedented, right? Never in the history of the world have people had to know so little, feel so little, do so little to live meaningfully in this world, to live what we might call a fulfilled human life, a life in which the full range of human capacities can be exercised. It's just breathtaking when you try to take something like the long view. I spent a good amount of time more recently reading indigenous writers and trying to understand what was it like for these people to be living in a world without electricity, without screens, without entertainment systems, with all the huge economic sort of infrastructure that makes everything available to you whenever you want it. And I'm thinking, first of all, these people should have been bored out of their minds. Because what are they doing? They're not watching TV. They're not listening to radio. They're not surfing the web. They're not scanning all the possibilities of things they could purchase. And yet you discover that these people actually had vibrant lives. That these people, what they did is they had this incredibly complex intelligence in which they were constantly trying to understand the world in which they live. And that meant knowing things in detail about when plants produce this fruit, because you got to be there at the right time to get the fruit. Otherwise, some other critter's going to eat it, because everything else paying attention to everything else. And so something as basic as their capacity for attention compared to our own, it just astounds me. And then when you think about the skill sets that these people had to have so that they could adequately either hunt or harvest the food that they needed to eat, the kinds of creativity that they called forth in themselves and each other to deal with often very difficult circumstances, right? When you're dealing with food deprivation or when you're dealing with illness. How did these people figure it out? Well, all sorts of creativity were called upon, all sorts of skill development. And so these people, right, we've historically just dismissed them as primitive. And I actually want to suggest it's the opposite. I mean, I'm not going back to, who was the guy, Salins, I think, who was the first who talked about the affluent society of indigenous peoples. But there is something to the argument that these people had a breadth of experience that puts ours into shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so how do you negotiate or renegotiate the relationship of religion and science when you're both aware of the gains we've made, but also the consequences?
Yeah. I think one thing that I like to hope that we can do, and I try to encourage in the people that I teach, is to turn back to their own experience. And what I mean by that is actually attend to your own body. Don't simply accept from other people, from marketers, from politicians, from even religious leaders, what the truth of your life is. Mm-hmm. Try to find ways that will actually help you understand yourself through the kinds of activities that you do. And that means growing things. It means learning to cook. It means learning how to make things. It learns turning away from screens and getting out into places. It means walking more rather than driving more. And these kinds of embodied practices might get you to see things a little bit more clearly, a little bit more honestly. Sometimes you'll just come face to face with your own confusion or bewilderment, which is perfectly fine. But the point is to don't accept the package that someone wants to tell you is you. But instead try to figure out things for yourself a bit more. And that means obviously becoming a little bit more inquisitive about the world, actually trying to understand where do the things that you depend on every day, what's their story, right? Everything has a story because everything is a commingling with everything else. Mm-hmm. And once you begin to understand the stories of things, your life, which is itself a story, can be enfolded into those stories a bit more, and you might have a bit more capacious understanding of yourself as involved in a world of things and not just an internet of things, which would be, I think, a real step forward. And what it'll do, I think, is it'll give you a kind of richness to some terms that we use theologically, sometimes rather flippantly, so that when we talk about the grace of God, you might actually think of it in terms of a raspberry that you just got to taste with some vanilla ice cream, mm-hmm. because you were involved in the growing of that raspberry. And maybe you milked a cow that produced the cream to make the ice cream. I mean, there's all kinds of ways by people becoming more deeply entangled in the world might be able to perceive something richer, deeper about the world's fragility, its vulnerability, but also its great surprise and mystery.
Mm-hmm. So the last question is, what are some books for people that are wanting to explore, think through this, or maybe have their imagination shooken up a bit?
Well, they got to read everything I've written, right?
Well, after they bought 3 copies of each of your books.
No, actually, Wirzba is a rather disreputable guy. So, Oh my, there's a number of things. I have gotten to like very much the work of this Native American botanist named Robin Kimmerer. She teaches in upstate New York. She wrote a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. Mm-hmm. So I recommend that book highly to a lot of people. Another person who I've gotten to really admire a great deal is a Scottish anthropologist who is recently retired. His name is Tim Ingold. Has a fabulous collection of essays called Being Alive. That would be a good volume to start there. Another friend of mine, Douglas Christie, has written a book called The Blue Sapphire of the Mind, which is his attempt to use some of the desert mothers and fathers and put them in conversation with nature writers to see how contemplative traditions can actually open our imaginations to where we are in the world. That's a really beautiful collection. And then I think also some of the poetry that has really meant a lot to me. I mean, Wendell Berry's poetry, the Sabbath poems, but also his cycle, Country of Marriage and Farming, a Handbook, fabulous set of poems. Mary Oliver is another one who I think helps waken us up to the world a bit. So I quite like her work too. And I think that's probably enough to get people going.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's great to be part of this program.
Awesome.